Okay, so we're going through the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you want a summary, don't watch this video. We're going through each and every single piece of Torah that I found parchment in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I tried to go through and find all the mistakes, all the new little differences, and we're going to go through them. So it's going to be a little bit tedious, but I thought really interesting, and I wanted to document it at all. So if you want to follow along, you can go to the Dead Sea Scroll website. They're all available online. You'll see on the side these links. You can't click them in the video, but you can hopefully match them up. I will show pictures of what all this parchments look like and then zoom in for each one. However, I only did that at the beginning. Eventually I got tired. This was a really long process and took a long time. Okay, this first parchment, let's get into it, is at the beginning of Shmois, and it's a fascinating one. Okay, it's gonna set the tone, I think, actually a lot, even though I didn't pick it to come first, it just happened. So v'chamesh nefesh, and 5 souls. Now, why is that so important? The beginning here is supposed to be saying and 70 souls went down to Egypt, and yet it says and 5. So what's and 5? So presumably 70 and 5. Now, maybe it's 60 and 5, right? Who knows what the number before this is because it's cut off. And that's a big problem, by the way, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, is so many of the mistakes are right around, not all of them, but so many of them, right around a ripped part. Does that mean they intentionally ripped it out because there was a mistake? It would just add so much. 65 is very different than 75. I don't know what to say. Because you would start explaining it maybe a little bit differently, meaning 65 went down plus, Yosef and his 2 sons. Now you're getting to 68. And okay, they just did the math a little bit differently. Does this change the meaning? No. Yaakov and his family went down. Yosef was there, right? It doesn't really change the Pashup Pshat, the meaning at all. But it's a fascinating thing, and it's going to, I think, when we focus on this for just a few minutes, probably more than we even need to, it's going to reveal something about the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think. I think that's going to be the interesting part here. Okay, why is it interesting? So first of all, in the Torah, it says 3 different places that it's 70 people went down. So it's highly unlikely for a mistake to happen, for all 3 places to be changed. The consistency of 70 seems very likely. And it's unlikely, by the way, for someone to say, oh, one place it says 75 and this place says, well, make them harmonize them. You see many times the Torah and the sages don't do that. No, if there's a difference, it's important. Here we're talking differently, and someone will have a reason. So that's not what's going on here. We have 3 different places. They're in, the exact same 70 count. So it's clearly 70. That's really all you really need to know. The Torah, to make 3 different changes, 3 different spots, what are the odds? And that's where I was going to leave it. Except I thought, well, when I looked at it, this is complicated because the New Testament also says 75. So that's interesting. So now, which is it? Now, would I trust the New Testament? No. There's lots of mistakes in the New Testament. And they lie constantly about verses, literally just taking things out of context. So but I was curious, what else can we do to show support for the Torah out of curiosity? And you have the Targumim, the translations to Aramaic that it says 70. Then even in the Septuagint that says 75, they only changed 2 places, right? It's not easy to change it everywhere, right? When you make a mistake, it's not easy unless it's intentional and you know what you're doing. It's not easy. So they left the one in Deuteronomy as 70. And many non-Jews look at the Septuagint as very unreliable due to things like this, where there's changes, it doesn't match the text or whatever it might be, even contradictions to the New Testament, things like that. I'm really not an expert, but they don't look at it as a reliable source, even people of that religion. And it's not our Septuagint, just for the record. It's just clearly a Greek name, and they presumably took the name. First of all, Septuagint includes the whole Old Testament, as they would call it. However, the only thing translated to Greek, as we know, is the Chumash. That's number 1. Number 2, the changes that we made, the 10 changes, which are discussed in Masechet Megillah, don't match, the Septuagint. There's lots of other changes. They don't have the same changes. It's clearly not the same thing. It wasn't the translation by the sages. Now, they do give some rationale, I think, over there. I didn't really look at it, but it would have to be that Joseph plus 9 people are counted to get to 75. Why? Because part of the 70 includes Joseph and his 2 sons who were already in Egypt. And, I was thinking maybe there's some weird calculation mistake that, they tried to rationalize. For example, you have 70 went down, and then wait, we have Yosef plus 2 sons. So now you get to 73. You're pretty close to 75 now. And we know there's 2 different opinions about, for example, is it Yocheved being born on the way? So you get to 74. And then maybe you include Yaakov, and now you get to 75. Of course, the 3 were already included in the number. For example, Yosef and his 2 sons were already included in 70. If you actually do the math, they're part of the 70. So I'm just trying to explain how you make a mathematical mistake here, but it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand. And the problem is 75 is not a common number in the Torah. 70 is, and it's a very important number, which adds to why would it be changed? Is it ideological or is this just a mistake? I'm leaning towards a mistake, and we'll see later why. But the 70 is so confirmed. It's so funny. You look at Josephus. He says, Jacob, encouraged by his dream, went on more cheerfully for Egypt with his sons and all their belongings. Right now, they were all in 70. So he says there were 70. It's funny. Why mention that? Why is that important to him? But he goes clearly through discussing, if we add these and, he goes through a calculation, 16 to the 54, and now you get the 70. So he goes through a whole calculation, how you get to 70. I would have thought, who cares? It's Yaakov and his family. But no, it's important, obviously, to the Torah. That goes without saying. But it's even important to Josephus. And so he mentions it as well. So, you're talking about at the time of the second temple being destroyed. That's around the time of Dead Sea Scrolls. He's already saying 70. Now, Ezekiel the tragedian presumably wrote tragedies. And he wrote them in Greek. And presumably Jewish. And likely in the 2nd century BC also mentions that it's 70. And you have Philo of Alexandria, right? He says there's 75 offspring of Yaakov, but he knows that 70 went down. So he knows the Torah says 70 went down. How does he know there's 75 offspring of Yaakov? I'm not sure. I don't know what the math is there. I don't know. Is that just a tradition? Is that something Jewish people say? I have no idea. But what I will say is this might be the source of the mistake. Okay? There might have been some idea that Yaakov had 75 children and they all went down to Egypt. I don't know, some of them may have been born later in Egypt. But Philo of Alexandria is clearly, I think, if not the source of the mistake, maybe he's touching on it. And so you're seeing how the Torah is not only correct, but how these mistakes can come in because someone thinks that they're smarter, right? 75 doesn't come up a lot in the Torah, so maybe it's not ideological. Maybe it's just that someone thinks someone else made a mistake and I'm smarter, so I'm going to put v'chamesh. Those kinds of mistakes are actually much trickier to find or point out because it's not grammatically wrong. It's not, it makes sense the way you read it. It doesn't make sense, of course, in the grand scheme of things. And that's why we can find these mistakes and know the Torah is correct. So very fascinating. And by the way, it shows that the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, they weren't copying. It seems like they weren't copying from a Torah. They're doing it somewhat from memory or somewhat from something else. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe there was some Greek thing influenced by Philo that they were copying from or translating from. An Israeli archaeologist did a lot of interesting research figuring out that someone who had written some Hebrew thing had actually translated from Greek. And that's why there were so many mistakes. I don't think that's what's happening here personally. I just think they were somehow influenced. They made a mistake, whatever it is. But it is fascinating to see that there is some sort of outside influence or some, editing or something going on here that caused this mistake. Oh, and the Sumerian text, which we'll use a number of times because they have a totally different tradition, the Sumerians. I wouldn't trust them. I don't think they're correct. They made lots of changes to the Torah for ideological reasons. They're presumably not as careful with the Torah as we have been. But nevertheless, if with all their changes, they have the exact same number as us. So, it just goes to show that 70 seems to be correct. That's what I would argue. Like I said, we don't need all of these proofs, these outside proofs, but I just bring them here because out of curiosity, I was so amazed how much was written about 70 or 75 and how many sources that seem to clearly confirm, the Torah. I just thought it was neat. It's such an odd detail that is brought down. Like I said, you don't need them. And the fact that the New Testament might somewhere say something in Acts or something like that, say something about 75. Okay, it's a mistake. New Testament makes tons and tons of mistakes. Were some of these scrolls edited to match up to that? Probably not. Probably not. This, like I said, is probably Philo, and that's probably why Stephen made the mistake. And there's probably some sort of Greek version that was floating around that caused some issue, and the Greek version's not so careful about the exact wording, and maybe they included this fact, and maybe that's where Philo even got it from. Who knows? But that's my guess. Okay, so going forward, here's an interesting one. In the middle of Shmos, we have the 7 Canaanite tribes, or however many they are, mentioned, right? So we have a Chiti, right over here we have a Chiti, and we have a Prizi, V'Amoiri, but these should be reversed. Okay, so you're making a list, you're doing it from memory. Oh, now look at this note. Now, more often it does actually say a Chiti v'Aprizi. So usually when the Torah says achiti, it usually says prizi right after. However, not when we mention emori. When we mention emori, it goes achiti ve'emori ve'prizi. So, the scribe made a mistake. They're just doing it from memory. Achiti, prizi, it's a very easy mistake to imagine. Now, when we're looking over here, we also have another problem, right? It doesn't say ve'hachivi. It doesn't say the and. So list, sometimes you don't have and, but it should have and. And here we have a big mistake. It should not only say ve'achivi, it should also say ve'avusi, which is what it does say over here. Instead, it adds in hagirgashi. It adds in this whole thing. Now, what I will say is sometimes we do have hachiti ve'agirgashi, which sounds like chivi maybe. And that's in Devarim at the beginning of the 7th chapter. And Vesa Knani, Vesa Girgashi, Vesa Yavusi. So sometimes you do go Girgashi and Yavusi as well. That's in Genesis 15. So once again, if you're doing it from memory, it's very easy to imagine that you're going to have this kind of mistake. And now, in terms of the Vavs, you should notice that we did have the Vavs over here. And assuming that this piece connects, which is very imaginable, right? They're clearly both the top of the parchments. They're lining up quite a bit. Especially in word order. Not saying it's for sure, but clearly the Vav's over there, and yet here we don't have a Vav, so that's a mistake. Now here we have another big mistake. I don't know, medium mistake. Elokei avichem, your father. Now avichem is your plural father. Shalachani aleichem, sent me to you. It should say avoseichem, your fathers. Elokei avoseichem, right? The God of your forefathers, not the God of your father. So that's a clear mistake. Now it's possible maybe there's a saf in here or something and it's avosam or, it's hard. Once again, the rip, why are the mistakes right around the rips? Even the Girgashi, it's funny, the rip goes in here. I don't know if that's a sign or anything, but here we have aleichem, and so it could just be the scribe, avichem, aleichem, they sound the same, but very different, right? Very different meaning. Well, subtly. I mean, same idea. The God of your father, God of your fathers, what's the big deal? It's like having an extra S. It's the same idea. But, in my humble opinion, that would change. There would be quite a lot written about why that was written that way. I think this is just a simple mistake. Like I said, aleichem, avichem, okay, this is what happens. You're writing quickly or from memory. And it's when you think about the type of mistakes we're talking about, it's amazing how much they get perfectly right from memory. Okay, lists, you can imagine how that's very easy to make a mistake. Lists, and there's different ways of listing them. And this type of thing also you could imagine. So, I want to say it's pretty impressive they get so much. Okay, Shmois Dalid. Here we have Yagad and Moshe Aaron, right? Moshe told Aaron all the things that he was sent and all the wonders he's supposed to perform. And I'm just pointing this out, just to give you a feeling of what we're reading, because as we're looking at it, why not? And going to Mitzrayim. Now here is mentioning Ela Aretz Asher Nasasi Asyadi, to the land which I've raised my hand, meaning I've given an oath. And yet here we have El Haaretz Asher Nishbat. Now, presumably it's nishbati, and presumably that's a word. Now, once again, near a rip. How wonderful. So it's hard to know what the full word is, and it looks like nun shin base ayin. I think that's an ayin personally. Kind of looks like this. Doesn't look like a shin. Nishbashti would be certainly wrong. In fact, it means the word mistake. In Aramaic or Hebrew, I don't know. We speak about it in Gemara. We say nishbashti. Something's a shibush. It's a mistake. So presumably they didn't write the word mistake mistakenly. This is nishbati, and it's a pretty common phrase actually. El Aretz Asher Nishbati is much more common than Nasasi. In fact, Asher Nasasi, I just looked it up. Asher Nasasi comes up 2 times in Chumash, and Asher Nishbasi comes up 10 times. So if once again you're doing it from memory, these are the types of mistakes you're gonna make. So I think also it just goes to show how these people in Qumran who are writing these scrolls, presumably, what are they doing? Presumably they are doing things from memory. Kaches matech v'ashlech livnei, right? Talking about the Moses, very famous part. Take the staff and throw it before Paro, right? It's going to turn to a nachash. That all these parchment, unless I'm pointing out that there's a problem, they're all good. I'm just pointing out, the phrases here, because they're famous phrases, things we all know. Lokeshish kash latevin, right? They have to bring the straw to make the bricks. Shmois 7:15. Nafach la'nachash. Here's the part where the staff turned to a snake or a reptile. Well, here's snake. And kachas masecha v'nate. Right, take your staff and stretch it out. One of the next plagues. Okay, now Bereshis Lamed Tes. Very famous phrase, V'yazav bigdoi biyada v'yanas. Yosef left, V'yazev, he left his clothing in her hand and ran away. Very famous incident. And I'm just pointing out how much of this is so perfectly letter for letter, everything's the exact same. Okay, here we're going to have a mistake. So first of all, it's V'yisa Yisrael v'yet oheloi ma'ala lemigdal eder. So first of all, Yisrael, another name for Yaakov, Jacob, traveled and he stretched his tent, mehalah, from there, lemigdal eder. Now here we have lemigdal, that's what it looks like, lemigdal. So we're missing mehalah from there. Now this would grammatically just not make sense. But you can see it looks like a mem over here. It looks like they're trying to put in the correction, mehalah, meaning even they knew there was a mistake. They're writing fast, whatever it is. Someone's looking over it. I'm not entirely sure. Now, here's an interesting, a couple of mistakes here. So we're talking about the children of Yaakov, right? Ruvain, and it should be Shimon, right? Giving a list, you should have the and, right? And same thing, Ubnei Bilha. Now, we don't have Binyamin once again. It looks like maybe you can see some ink here for an U. And we have Vinaftali here, but we don't have, I think it's Ubnei Zilpa. So what is going on here? Well, like once again, it's hard. You're making a list. When do you add the vavs? When do you not? Sometimes you do. Like I think Bnei Rachel does not have Bnei Rachel. So once you're not doing Bnei Rachel, you're just saying Bnei Rachel. So then you say Bnei Bilha, right? Bnei Zilpa. And once you're doing that, well, maybe you miss Veshimon, right? These are the types of mistakes, once again, that are so easy to make when you're doing it from memory, which is why we're careful to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, this is an interesting mistake. Asher Yulad Loi, that's what it should say, that were born to him in Padan Aram. Right, you can see Aram here. So everything else is pretty much correct, except for Yalda Loi. She gave birth to him in Padan Aram. It doesn't, I don't think it makes as much sense. Personally, I think Yulad Loi makes a lot more sense. Was given birth to him, meaning to Yaakov. That's my understanding of the verse anyway. Let's see if I just try and pull this verse up. 1 second. Apologies. This is the problem. You do it from memory. Okay, so 35:18. 1 second. Let's Yulad Loi. So the whole verse is Ela b'nei Yaakov. These are the children of b'nei Yaakov. Asher Yulad Loi b'Padan Aram, that were born to him in Padan Aram. So that doesn't. So Yalda Loi doesn't really make sense. And now I understand. If it was going to talk about them giving birth, it should say Yaldu, because there's multiple women. It doesn't really make sense to say Yalda. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. Maybe they understood whoever was writing the parchment, because the beginning of the verse, to be fair, is Ubnei Zilpa Shifchas Leah, right? The children of Zilpa, who was the handmaiden of Leah, Gad va'Asher, that she gave birth to, those were her sons, Gad and Asher. And now it says, Ela b'nei Yaakov, these are the children of Yaakov, Asher Yulad Loi b'Padan Aram. Now, what is that going on? Is that going only on Zilpa? So if it's only going on Zilpa, you can understand, maybe you're right, get it right, Yaldaloi, that she gave birth to him. But it's odd. Why would we have this phrase only for Zilpa anyway? No, in reality, this is going for all the children, and it's Yulad Loi, that were born to him in Padan Aram. Once again, does it actually make a difference? I mean, in deep Yesoid and Remez and Drash, yes, of course, and every letter is important here. But in terms of Pasha Pshat, it would not change anything. This is just a very simple mistake. Yulad is a very uncommon word. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it never comes up in Chumash. Okay, now we're going to deal with a great spot. Oh, except for that one spot, of course. Now we're going to deal with this great spot over here, Bereshis, the very beginning. Okay, and here you can see, even though it's faded out, Yehi v'yehi boiker yom sheni, and it was the morning and it was the second day. So even with the faded out parts, because it matches up so perfectly, you can actually work out what the words are. And you have to be careful not to trick yourself, of course, to want to read what you want to read. So sometimes you just can't tell, some words, whatever it is. Except you can see there's lamids, so you can match certain things up. It's an amazing thing that this whole thing matches. Eshnei ha'ma'eres ha'gedolim. So that's what's going on here. Ha'gedolim, except it looks like hadalim. But of course, once again, they put in the gimel to correct what's going on, and they just insert it over here. And over here, you can also see Hagadolim. They didn't make that mistake. There is the Gimel, the Dalid. Now the Lamed, you can't quite see, but you know it's there. And the Yud and the Mem Sofit. That's what I mean. It's faded out, but you can see the top of the Lamed coming around and the Yud. So you know that's the word. And it's perfect otherwise. Okay, now V'Shem Anara Shlishi Chidekel, talking about Gan Eden. The third river was Chidekel. Now we have Hashem Elokim, Hashem Elokim, Hashem Elokim 4 times. That's most of the parchment, but it was easy to find, even though it's hard to read this part because Chidekel's kind of cut off here, and it's just a shlishi. But 4 Hashem Elokims, and you can figure out exactly where it is. That's pretty uncommon, even though they're not in one verse. And you can see there's a tear here that they seem to have connected. All right, Bereshis 5:2. Oh, that was it. Mincha LaHashem. So presumably this is talking about, I'm not sure what this is talking about. Oh, Oved Adama. So he's the one who works the ground. That's Noach. We're talking about Noach after he comes out of the the ark, and he's bringing a sacrifice to Hashem. So that matches up. Once again, Bereshis, the beginning, but this is a little bit different writing than the previous one. Previous section, we don't have Bereshis, we just have Elokim as a Shemayim V'Asar. It's a very famous line. This is all correct, except over here, right? It's presumably Elokim called the day, the light, Yoim. It should be Yoim, day. And instead it says Yoimam, which really means their day. Doesn't make sense grammatically. This is just an obvious mistake. I don't know how he made this mistake. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Maybe, once again, when a Sofer writes, he doesn't write the word necessarily. He writes it letter by letter. So he might go Yom and then go Yud, Vav, Mem, and he lost track and wrote another Mem without reading the word. You're writing a lot. So it's very easy to make these kinds of mistakes. It's also possible that he didn't like that it was an open Mem and he couldn't erase it, so he just put a closed Mem, and he knows you're going to understand what's going on here. Also possible. It's hard to get in the mind of someone. Because you notice they're not erasing things, which is interesting. Okay, Bereshis Aleph Vav, they don't erase it to correct the mistake. They write the letter above. Now, maybe that's temporary, just like over here. Maybe it's temporary, and they're going to make the correction. Okay, Bereshis 1:6 also, right? You see the Rakia, talking about the firmament over here. It's correct. Now here, it's Yikavu Hamayim Mitachas L'Shamayim. It's not so crazy. To gather the water that's below to the water, but it doesn't really make sense. It really should be Hashamayim. L'Shamayim doesn't, there's a part of me that feels like in flow, it kind of flows, like it reads well, but it doesn't really make sense. Yikavu Mayim Mitachas Hashamayim, underneath the heavens, right? So gathered the water underneath the heavens, not gathered the water mitachas, from underneath to the heavens. Doesn't really make sense. I don't know how to make sense of that. Maybe they had a way of making sense of that, or once again, just a simple mistake. L'Shamayim, I'm sure, is probably just as common as Hashamayim. All right, now we have an interesting section over here with quite a few mistakes, right? It says, talking about the dream that Paro had, it should be Tivla and Na. This is an Endanun. So presumably there's not going to be a hey over here. This is very uncommon. You try and keep words together. It does happen in the old way of writing, but they put periods, dots between words, although there's spaces here. So I'm not entirely sure. Presumably, once again, you're a rip. We can't see what's on the other side if there's a hey. But the truth is, you could put a vowel over tivla and pronounce it without the hey, like it had a hey. So it's not that crazy of a mistake anyway. Now tzmachos, I think that's actually correct. Let's just look that up really quickly. Bereshis 41. What is it? Tzmachos. Let's see if we can find that. One second, I apologize. So what is the line here? Kadim tzmachos is correct. So I don't know why I highlighted that. Tzmachos is correct. I don't know. What can you do? And if it's not correct in this exact spot, which it does seem, achrehen, it seems correct. This is the right spot. It's tzmachos. I'm not sure why I highlighted it. But here, hashadafois, it should be hadakois. Now you can see dakois over here. So they knew that it's the word dakois, right? They know that's what happens. And also over here, I think this is ve'ein poiser oisam. There was no one to interpret them. It should be poiser, and oisam also should have a vav here. Listen, many times you write words with a vav, without a vav. They're pronounced the same. They mean the same. So once again, you're doing it from memory. How are you going to remember every single vav that is supposed to be added or not added? That's going to be hard to imagine. Okay, but in terms of hashidafos va'adakos, I'm not entirely sure the mistake, except just to say that, that whether the corn or the wheat, whether it's thin or burnt, you can imagine how when you throw around these words so many times, you can make a mistake which one it is. I don't know. It's not going to change the meaning. Okay, now this is actually an important thing. Mashkim as paro lemor. Mashkim? Okay, I'm not sure. Oh, Sar HaMashkim. It's talking about the person the butler, who spoke to Paro saying, Es alav decha. Now it's going to be a big mistake. Ve yitain oisi b'mishbar. Es al avdecha doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense. How do I translate that? That would be like saying to on your servants. So a clear mistake. Now, this is not a memory mistake. This is not a language mistake. The person just made a mistake here. They just skipped a whole phrase, which you see they've corrected over here. And it doesn't grammatically make sense. So it just goes to show you the type of mistakes people in the Dead Sea Scrolls are liable to make. Now, why did this happen? Did he go to lunch and come back and he continued from the wrong spot without reading? Was he copying from something and skipped a line? Did he get confused? I'm not entirely sure. But presumably the way it should read is Lemor es chatati ani maskir hayoim. Right, my sins I'm going to remind you today. Paro katsav. Right, Paro was angry alavdecha on his servants. V'yitein oisi, and you or on your servant, but put me in prison. Right, Beis Sarat Tabachim, the house of the I don't know the prince, but the person in charge of slaughtering. Okay, I don't want to get too far into it, but just a total mistake here. So certainly I would say this scribe, not so reliable. So any of the other mistakes, I wouldn't put much stock in. But once again, they're the type of mistakes that you can imagine would happen just from memory. Also, over here, it should be v'nechel ma, right? So the Samaritan has v'nechelam, or however to pronounce that exactly. And v'nechel ma is less common of a word, to be fair. But this kind of mistake, hashidafos, not Samaritan, it says dakos. What's my point? My point is, I think that these are just mistakes that a person could make just through sheer error. And that's why you're going to have these weird kind of mistakes. And that's why some of them will be in the Samaritan one because they're less careful and some of them won't. All right, Bereshis, the beginning, right? You can see v'achoshech, v'yir Elokim, right? I don't think this overlaps with any of the other spots. Biggest mistake here is taninim. There's an extra yud. Once again, you don't have to have it. It pronounced the same way. It means the same thing. It's called a malay and a chaser. That's what happens sometimes. Okay, so this is, I don't know, one of these small things. But once again, I don't know if it really matters to show you exactly where everything is. Oh, what's going on here? Presumably Meretz Migurei Aviv, maybe, where my father lived. Okay, but it's Bereshis, checks out. Bereshis Mem Gimel. All right, now here's going to be an interesting mistake. V'hisaktihu, very odd word. It should be v'hisaktiv. It is so close to the same meaning. Instead of I will stand him lefanecha before you, I believe it's talking about trying to get back Shimon or taking Binyamin down to Mitzrayim, and whether he's going to be brought in front of him or not. So I will stand him, which is the Masoretic text and the Samaritan, they both agree this is v'hisaktiv, that's the correct thing. And instead it's you stood him versus you stood he, right? The mistake is you stood he instead of him. It doesn't really make sense exactly. You could imagine in a world where maybe it would make sense, like if you change the whole sentence, but this is a concatenation. V'hisag and tiv is like the word a love, right? And v'hisag and who, right? Which is he instead of him. So very minor mistake. And in fact, I noticed that it's only just a yud to a hey. Very small mistake, one letter mistake. Does it change the meaning? No. It means the exact same thing, but it's grammatically doesn't work quite as well. It doesn't make as much sense. So they made a mistake. Once again, these are the types of mistakes they're making. So minor. You're looking at the rest of this, that is so perfect. Yoim huletis is paroi, vayas. So here we have an extra vav, but that's fine, huletis. But yoim hulad es paro. Once again, doesn't really make sense. It should be, I believe, yoim huletis is like it's like a noun, his day of birth, that he was given birth on. This doesn't really make sense. I don't even know how to translate this because it doesn't make sense. It's like the day that bore paro. I don't know. I'm not sure how to translate that anyway. But the Sumerian Pentateuch says huletis, right? It adds the vav, but it has the saf, so that's nice. Now over here we have an interesting mistake, right? We have ushudafois kadim, right? That all matches up, but dakois, and yet we have, once again, near a rip, right? All these things near rips. It's very frustrating, although maybe a lot of it's near rips, but you don't find like, okay, I don't know. Nevertheless, I like to complain. Okay, so it says this yud mem, so did they write dakim, and they just made a mistake, but they wrote shudafos, right? We saw other places it says dakos. Did they skip the word dakos and just write shibalim? But then it doesn't make sense because it says usha dufos, sorry, that they were burnt. So it's thin and burnt. Doesn't make sense. There's stalks and burnt kadim, before. Just doesn't work. There's clearly a mistake. So I would hazard to guess they just left out the word dakos. They just left it out, just like we've seen a number of times. Sometimes you leave it out. And Sumerian Pentateuch obviously says dakos, or they just wrote dakim and they put it into the right conjugation. I don't know what the right word is here, but they just put it in the wrong way and put dakim. All right, once again, big picture, we're just going through these small pieces. V'yomer li Yosef, right, and said to Yosef, that checks out. Here we have Beretz Kanan B'derech Ba'oid Kivras Aretz. Now you're looking at these words. These are very odd words, very weirdly written, uncommon. Lavoy Efrasa, right? It's all checking out. It's so amazing what they can do from memory. He Beis Lechem, and here is your mistake. There's a phrase missing. Ve'ekra v'sham b'derech Efras, and I buried her there at Efras, and that is Beis Lechem. Now, how do you make this mistake? This one, I think, once again, you miss a phrase, whatever it is, we see sometimes that happens. But here it's really easy, because Efrasa and Efras, and especially if you could pronounce it Efrasa over here, right? You put the vowel. And so once you are doing it from memory, and you know Efras, he Beis Lechem, that's what you just put in, and then you keep going. No problem. So it's very easy to understand how these people are making these mistakes. It's a big mistake because the whole point of the verse, right, when I was on my way, like at this distance to go to Ephrasa, I buried, like the whole point of mentioning is to mention that you buried her at Ephras and he's Beis Lechem. Otherwise, you've missed the whole point of the verse, in my humble opinion. So it's an obvious mistake. Right, it's obvious. Also over here we have Yomer Yosef. It should be El Aviv, and it says presumably B'nai. Once again, we don't really know. I don't know what's going on exactly. So I don't know. Based off of just doing it from memory, B'nai is obviously a common thing. I don't know. I didn't work on this one too much to try and explain it. Maybe I should have. Okay, this is also an interesting one. He brought them to him via Chab. I think if I can read this, it's sometimes hard to read without having the Chumash as well, because their writing is not perfect. I don't want to insult them at all. But it seems to say via Chabek loy, via shake, or maybe it's lahem and via shake lahem. I don't know. But it's talking about hugging and kissing. Now I can pull it up. Maybe I should pull up the exact verse just so I can get the exact phrasing. Let's see. Chabek, so it is lahem and lahem. So it should be v'yachabek lahem. So you can see it's kind of cut off here. V'yishoik or v'yishak lahem, that he hugged them and kissed them, except it should be opposite. It should be he kissed them and he hugged them. So once again, you're making a list. It's very easy to get things out of order. Also, it's very easy to logically think that you hug someone, then kiss them. Here, he kissed them and then hugged them. Maybe he was kissing their hand. Maybe he was blowing them a kiss, whatever it is. But it won't change anything. He hugged them and kissed them. You just got them in the wrong order. But I think when you do it from memory, that's obvious. And the Samaritan agrees with the Torah, with our Chumash. So, it's an obvious mistake that they made. Now, once again, Bereshis, probably a little bit different Bereshis. You can kind of see Bereshis here. It looks like they've taped these things together. Oh, you know what, Yomam, now I remember. When I was going through this, I thought this was a new piece of parchment. No, I just stuck two pieces of parchment together that we already saw. They had the exact same mistakes. Okay, so now we have another Bereshis, and we'll look at this. V'yomer Elokim, right? That it says God over there. And here we have Ma'oros with a Vav. I'm not sure if we saw this before. Eshnei Ma'oros with a Vav when it shouldn't. But once again, it's pronounced the same way. It's supposed to have a Cholam and O. They just put the Vav in. And, just a regular, how would this look without this X-ray or infrared scan? It would be so hard to read these. So it is beautiful. This is where that extra Vav is. I can't even imagine saying that's an extra Vav. So I don't know why I put this in, except maybe just to point out maybe that there's corrections, another correction. Bereshis, we have a parchment with just the word Bereshis and spelt wrong, right? So I'm missing an aleph, unless somehow there's like a faded aleph in here, but presumably not. There's just a mistake, and not even, unless it's maybe a hole. But, what happened here? So either they made a mistake, so get rid of it, or start again. Why not erase it? Why not erase the word Bereshis? So it seems odd to me. Maybe they didn't want to waste the time. Maybe they're moving on a fast pace. They have tons of parchment, no worries. It's like having a paper. You write the wrong thing, you could erase it and go again. If it's the first word, maybe you just start fresh. I just thought it was fascinating that you just have one word, clearly nothing written. You made a mistake. And by the way, the very first word, the first word that every Jewish person knows, and you missed out a letter, and an important letter, not one pronounced though, but right, Bereshis, it's kind of silent. But I think it just goes to show how these mistakes and how easy it is to make a mistake, even when you know exactly what you're doing and what you're supposed to be doing. And he wrote it, and he got to the end of the word and went, look at what I did. Oh, no, I missed the aleph. And he just, sometimes they're lucky and sometimes they're not. And it's hard to describe how easy it is to make a mistake when you're moving. Now, presumably, this is the first thing he wrote, but maybe he was writing parchment right before this. Who knows? And you're trying to go fast, it's very easy to make these kinds of mistakes. But I think it's really important to point out that mistake that's so obviously wrong, and he knows it's wrong, everyone knows it's wrong, and yet he made it. And yet, how few mistakes they're making from memory. It's so impressive to me. Okay, Bereshis Mem Beis Tes Zayin, I went through this whole thing. Okay, I don't know exactly. It was probably a real struggle to figure out what these words were. Bereshis 41, but once again, you figure it out because, you get one word like Yosef, and then you have to find Elokim or whatever it might be, and you figure out exactly where it is in Chumash because everything matches so well that you can actually track these things down. Once again, very hard to Ves Aser, maybe that's, I don't know what that is, and 10. But here we have Svare Binyamin, and now you know exactly where this is in Chumash, and that's why I'm pointing it out. Why? It's the necks, plural necks of Binyamin, which by the way is a very funny phrase, Svare, that the necks, plural of Binyamin, talking about Yosef falling on his necks to cry. He cried on not just one side, but presumably the other side, and Binyamin only falls on one. And so it's interesting, even these drushes, the yuds and everything, match up. It's such a beautiful thing, enjoyable to see. Not necessary, we know the Torah is correct, but enjoyable nonetheless. It's just beautiful to look at these parchments from so long ago. Okay, now once again, Yim Oros, the right, an extra vav. And here, there should be an extra vav, but there is an ulu moadim. And here it should be ulu yamim, that's correct, ve shanim. It's talking about, by the way, the sun and moon, are there going to be for the for signs, and muadim for the festivals, appointed times, and for day, and for years. But it's ulu, they write ulu shanim, so they added the extra lamed here. And we don't know. Presumably it's Shanim. And maybe they wrote Uliyamim. Uliyamim, they wrote it twice. Who knows? And Vishanim. So once again, the mistakes are right around the ripped spots. It's so annoying. It's just so frustrating. Like, who knows what's going on here? Now, Uliyamim is correct. And presumably that's just they copied it and Ulashanim instead of Vishanim. Now, Ula Moadim without the Vav comes up 3 times in Tanakh. And with the Vav, I don't know, I think just one time. Ula Moadim. Moadim, I'm sure, comes up tons of times. But Ula Moadim, 3 times with the Vav versus 1 time without. Sorry, it's the opposite. 3 times without the Vav meaning the mistake they made, versus one time in Chumash where it does have the Vav. So you can imagine they left out the Vav. Maybe they're more familiar with the rest of Tanakh or whatever it might be. Once again, it's not going to change anything. Ma'oros with an extra Vav here. Okay, now we're getting into Ivris. We're going to call it here. It's a really long video. Thanks for watching. I think it's a fascinating thing to go through one by one. Hopefully I'll have a summary video that'll make things more interesting, but I feel like you really lose the flavor if you don't go through everything. I gain so much from seeing it all, but you know, only if you have the time and the interest. I don't know if it's the most fascinating thing and necessary thing, but either way, thank you so much.